O Lord, for our own sake did fast. You fasted 40 days and 40 nights. Give to us that kind of discipline, that our flesh, being subdued by the power of your Spirit and word, may ever exercise godly discipline in the motions and movements of mind and heart toward righteousness and true holiness, to thy honor and glory, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Cranmer's library was famous in its own day. He's moved on to earlier attempts to reconstruct Cranmer's library. It is best known amongst the most notable of private collections to have survived from the Tudor period. Among his contemporaries, it attracted comment from Roger Ascham, January 1535, quoting Dr. Giles, the whole works of Roger Ascham. Hugh Latimer, Parker Society, page 211, and the Italian refugee Peter Vermigli, Tractatio de Sacramento Eucharistii. Martyr's main interest was the range of Cranmer's theological reading and his diligence in annotating what he read. And its importance has been recognized since then by a host of biographers, bibliographers, and historians of the period down to the present day. Among them, and he quotes Pollard, whom we're working in, Wickham Legg, Cranmer's liturgical projects, W. Bromley, got him, Ratcliffe's The Theological Work of Archbishop Cranmer, Journal of Historical Studies, Dugmore's Mass and the English Reformers, Greenslade's The English Reformers, Walsh's Cranmer and Fathers. Among bibliographers, Letcher. Who else do we have here? The Lumley Library. Okay. And much constructive use of it was made to illustrate his life and career in the quincentenary exhibition on Cranmer at the British Library in autumn 1989. Although some individual items in the collection had been singled out for mention, such as Gregory Nissen in Greek by Ascham and a copy of Huss by Strip, there was no attempt to reconstruct in contents in detail until the 1880s, when C.E. Burbidge, a classical scholar at Emmanuel College and later rector of Backwell in Somerset, began his researches among major institutional and cathedral libraries, as well as some older school foundations and private collections. His investigations enabled him to compile a list of 283 printed books and 48 manuscripts, which he appended to his liturgies and offices of the church, a standard work in his day on the sources of Anglican liturgy, published in 1885. This was followed in 1892 by a considerably amplified survey detailing an additional 63 books and 8 manuscripts in Bernard Quatrich's contributions toward a dictionary of English book collectors. Burbidge's primary concern had been to trace the liturgical sources of the English prayer book and to demonstrate the breadth of Cranmer's reading, principally in the early fathers and church councils, but also in medieval scholastics, Christian humanists, and the writings of the Reformation period on both sides of the doctrinal divide. To this end, Burbidge arranged his catalogue under such headings: patristic, scholastic, biblical, on the Protestant controversy, and so on, as well as demonstrating Cranmer's broader interests in historical, classical, and medical writings. The classification had the great merit of linking the contents of the library to Cranmer's concerns as Archbishop, liturgical reformer, and theologian, for his was very much a working library rather than the collection of a bibliophile. And the point was further reinforced by Burbidge's occasional observations on the historical significance of individual items and the presence of Cranmer's manuscript notations of the text. In his preface to the earlier catalogue, Burbidge had referred briefly to the later history of Cranmer's library and its dispersal as it passed through the hands first of Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, and then through those of his son-in-law, John, Lord Lumley. And it was the publication in 1956 by Sears Jayne and Francis Johnson of the 1609 catalogue of the Lumley Library that has made possible the first significant advance in the modern reconstruction of Cranmer's library since Burbidge's work at the end of the last century. Although the main interest of the editors was in Lumley rather than Cranmer, they did record Cranmer's earlier ownership of Lumley's books whenever applicable, and this made possible the addition of 11 further manuscripts and 135 printed books to the 56 manuscripts and 346 books Burbidge had already listed in 1892. The majority of these new items, 6 manuscripts and 85 books, were discovered among the books of the Old Royal Library in what is now the British Library in London. But there were substantial additions to the number of printed books recorded at Cambridge University Library, 12 volumes, and Emmanuel College, 19 volumes, and evidence of the increasing dispersal of Cranmer's library was provided by the number of locations, some 11 locations. As a result of Jayne and Johnson's work, the known number of locations had further increased to nearly 40, though still limited to the United Kingdom and Ireland. And the extent of Cranmer's library as it survived had grown to 67 manuscripts and 481 books. By the time of Mary's accession in 1553, it was estimated that Cranmer's library probably contained about 500 printed books and about 100 manuscripts. Jayne and Johnson did not promise a revision of Burbidge's work on Cranmer themselves, but they did point to the possibility of further additions from a study of the manuscript catalogue of the Old Royal Library, now at the British Library, to which most of Lumley's library had passed. This catalogue had been compiled about 1761, soon after the Royal Library had been presented by King George II to the recently founded British Museum at Montague House, and recorded former owners of books listed though without identifying the actual copy. It had already proved invaluable to Jayne and Johnon in their own work on Lumley's library. Burbidge's pioneering work has not been updated since 1892, despite its reissue by G.E. Duffield in 1964. But new information had already come to light from other scholars working in related fields, and some of this had been incorporated into annotated copies of Burbidge, some of those at Durham University by Dr. Doyle, Cambridge University Library, the late F.E. Jenkinson, and Lambeth Palace, summarized in an article by Christine Mackwell in 1973. As a result of these, further work on the manuscript catalogue of the Old Royal Library and on-sale catalogues, together with extensive inquiries and research at the major institutional libraries, as well as smaller collections, it now has been possible to add 100 more books and manuscripts to those already identified as Cranmer's by Jayne and Johnon. The number of known locations, increasing evidence of the wide dispersal of Cranmer's library, has risen by 24 to some 65, including some in the United States and one at Göttingen in Germany. There is good reason to suppose that the number of additions to his library will continue to increase as books exchange hands through auction. Further information comes to light from surviving sale catalogs, and more attention is given by some of the greater institutional libraries to the provenance and earlier history of the collections in their care. One disturbing feature of the present situation is the increasing number of books from Cranmer's library which now have to be categorized as not located, though known to have been present in the Old Royal Library in 1761, were listed in the 1609 library catalog, or in varying degrees as inaccessible to scholars because they now form part of private collections. The problem was already evident when Jayne and Johnon wrote in 1956, and nearly a fifth of the items listed in the Lumley list, 1981, fell into one of these categories. The recent case of 1984 of Cranmer's annotated copy of the Church Annals, edited by Jacques Merlin in 1524, a book which Burbidge had been hunting for in the last century without success, is a painful reminder of this increasing trend. It is now in the hands of a private collector in the United States. Few institutional libraries these days are in a position to disperse £23,100, the price reached at the auction for such a book, however historically important. He moves on now to the fate of Cranmer's library and the problem of reconstruction. The problem facing Burbidge, which persists to this day, was the lack of any contemporary catalog or inventory of Cranmer's books from which a modern reconstruction can be made. The case of Cranmer's libraries is unlike the rather later ones of Andrew Perne, died 1589, master of Peterhouse, Cambridge, 1554 to 1589, or Edmund Jest, Bishop of Salisbury, died 1577, which can to a great extent be reconstructed from contemporary inventories or research at their present location. The evidence for reconstructing Cranmer's library is for the most part the almost random survival of actual books themselves, now very widely dispersed, with the familiar ownership inscription Thomas Contuarian on the title page, generally at the top margin, or some instance at the presence of manuscript and annotations either in his own hand or the hand of one of his secretaries. Early in the reign of Queen Mary, an inventory of Cranmer's books had been ordered when his property was confiscated by the crown as an attainted person in 1553. Two forms of this inventory survive at the Public Record Office, both unfortunately incomplete. Evidently earlier is an often rough draft and details only of his goods and chattels at Lambeth, though an endorsement in another hand states that it relates, as doubtless it once did, to the properties at Croydon, Bekesbourne, Canterbury, and Ford. The other, among the inventories of a number of attainted persons, is a fair copy and lists, often in great detail, of his goods at Lambeth, Bekesbourne, Ford, and Canterbury. Neither inventory lists his library, though this was often done for valuation purposes, as the collection of 16th century Cambridge inventories by Dr. Leadham Green. Nor does it even hint at the existence of a library beyond ambiguous references to presses, to one press for books at his manor at Bekesbourne. The only books mentioned are a Bible with other books of service, which by the time the second inventory had been completed, had been conveyed and stolen away from the Archbishop's chapel at Lambeth. The evidence of these inventories is tantalizing and largely negative. Cranmer was executed 3 years later in 1556, leaving no will. No contemporary record of the events, of the contents of the library, therefore survives. Until such a list is discovered, the books that must remain form the basis of any modern reconstruction. Though it may be possible to conjecture with varying degrees of probability other items that may have belonged to it, from references in his published writings to his manuscript commonplace collections, especially where there is also some supporting evidence from entries in the 1609 Lumley Collection. The surest evidence of Cranmer's ownership in the books that remain, both printed and in manuscript, is the familiar Thomas Contuarian signature on the title page, usually at the top margin. Despite occasional claims to the contrary, the signature is clearly not in Cranmer's own hand. It differs from the form which appears in his correspondence and in official documents, and while it is true that several different forms of his signature occur in these documents, none of them corresponds exactly with that found in his books. It seems probable that the signature in his books was written by his secretary, though apparently not by Robert Maurice or one of his staff. It is not unlikely that the books were signed in this way over a comparatively short period of time. The examples inspected exhibit no significant differences between those found in books presumably dating from the earliest period of his career at Cambridge, the scholastic commentaries, some of them acquired evidently secondhand, and his later acquisitions, one of which carries an imprint as late as 1552-53. One possibility is that the books were signed as a mark of ownership. At about the same time, he was ordered to prepare an inventory of goods during the summer of 1553, following the collapse of the attempt by Duke of Northumberland's government to oust Mary from the succession in favor of Lady Jane Grey. Although heavily implicated in this plot, Cranmer, unlike most of the others involved, was still free from arrest until his declaration against the Mass finally provoked the Marian authorities to take action against him in the middle of September. If John Fox is to be believed, Cranmer had already settled his debts in anticipation of the forfeiture of his goods if attainted for treason. And although neither of the extant inventories contains any list of his library, it is quite possible that the books themselves were marked at the same time to prevent their dispersal before valuation. The later history of Cranmer's library. The greater part of the printed books and manuscripts which have survived from Cranmer's library have done so because they were absorbed into the libraries, first of Henry Fitzalan, 12th Earl of Arundel, and subsequently, and not for a much longer period, that of his son-in-law, John Lord Lumley. Arundel, died 1589, had served Henry VIII and Edward VI until at least 1550 as Lord Chamberlain, and was rewarded with the post of steward in the household of Queen Mary for the part he played in bringing about her accession and the downfall of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, in 1553. When Cranmer's property was confiscated by the Crown later in the same year, Arundel was among the purchasers of furniture and other items listed in the inventory of goods of attainted persons made by the order of the Queen's Majesty. And it is probable that he acquired the Archbishop's library at about the same time, even though no record of sale or content survives. Although the 1553 inventories make no mention of Arundel's acquisition of Cranmer's library, or indeed acknowledge its existence, there is one other fragment of circumstantial evidence which may shed some light on its location at the time his goods were confiscated. It is known from the draft inventory that the valuation of Cranmer's property had extended to all 5 residences: Lambeth, Croydon, Bekesbourne, Canterbury, and Ford. In the draft inventory as it now survives, only that for Lambeth is extant. The fair copy of the inventory, however, covers 4 of his residences: Lambeth again, Bekesbourne, Ford, and Canterbury, though at none of these is there any mention of books or a library. The inventory of the 5th, the Archiepiscopal Manor at Croydon, used as a favorite summer residence since at least the 13th century, is missing. Neither of the surviving inventories, therefore, lists its contents. Yet it is clear from another source that Croydon Manor was in fact the location, perhaps the principal location, of Cranmer's books. On Monday, 25 May 1551, a severe earthquake occurred at Croydon and other parts of North Surrey, sufficiently noteworthy to be mentioned by a number of contemporary chroniclers, and still recalled nearly 25 years later by Edmund Grindal in a letter to Archbishop Matthew Parker. The Polish reformer John Olasko, who had stayed with Cranmer on a number of occasions, both at Lambeth and Croydon, was in London at the time, and in a letter to Albert Hardenberg a few days after the earthquake, he reported, "The house in which he, Cranmer, now resides, 7 miles distant from here, together with the whole district, was shaken by a severe earthquake on Monday last, namely the 25th. All the books fell from their cases to the ground. All the windows were broken, and yet the house remained undamaged. In the town, some houses fell down. This earthquake lasted nearly 2 hours, from 1 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon." If his account is to be believed, any list of Cranmer's books, therefore, would most probably have been in that part of the inventory that related to Croydon, no longer with the rest of the 1553 inventory. Whether it went with the library to Arundel, its new owner, we can only conjecture. But Jayne and Johnon, the editors of the 1609 Lumley catalogue, may well be correct in interpreting Arundel's acquisition of Cranmer's books as a royal favor and reward for his support at a crucial time. We quote from Jayne and Johnon, "We need not be surprised that there is no record of Arundel's having bought the books. He would have only had to suggest to Mary that it was appropriate to confiscate non-such the books of a man who declared her illegitimate, and the word would have become deed." Interesting. By contemporary standards, Arundel already had a substantial collection of his own, estimated at about 400 volumes. But he was also acquiring books with a view to the education of his children. One of them, Jayne, who had recently married John Lord Lumley, who had a fine collection of books and paintings at the family seat, Lumley Castle, a little over 5 miles to the north of Durham. Although Arundel seems to have held on to a few of his recent acquisitions, the majority of Cranmer's books were passed straight to his son-in-law, Lumley. This is evident from the books themselves. Of Cranmer's books that have come down by way of Lumley, about 575, only 9 items and 17 volumes carry Arundel's mark of ownership. Arundel's own background in matters of religion was Catholic, and to a person of his tastes, for whom, as Jayne and Johnon put it, a library was not a workroom, but a showplace. Cranmer's collection would have had little appeal, his books often heavily annotated and indifferently bound. The Cranmer books that Arundel is known to have retained, all but one now in the British Library, were a small collection of the more desirable items, among them the Canterbury Bosworth Psalter of the 10th and 11th century, the great 6-volume Complutensian Polyglot Bible, 1514 to 1517, though not issued till 1520. The Paris Folio editions of the Latin Fathers, Jerome and Gregory I, the Venice Folio edition of Apuleius, the Golden Ass, 1510, Forest's Chronicles, Paris, 1538, and 2 works of undoubted orthodoxy by John Drietos, De Ecclesiasticus Scripturis et Dogmatibus, Louvain, 1543, and the anti-Lutheran attack on the Augsburg Confession by Johannes Davantria, published at Cologne in 1535. Arundel's Catholic background, shared also by his son-in-law Lumley, may account for the fact that not a single book of Protestant tendency was retained in either library. Whether these were deliberately weeded out by Arundel in accordance with Mary's wishes, or whether they had been given away or removed from Cranmer's library at an early stage, is uncertain and perhaps may never be known. But the few Protestant works that have been identified as survivals from Cranmer's library have all come down without either the Arundel or Lumley signatures, and with one possible exception, were never among the books in the Royal Library, which later formed the nucleus of the British Museum collection. The Marian Proclamation of 13 June 1555, enforcing the Statute against heresy, had contained a long list of prohibited authors, and a further proclamation right at the end of her reign, 6 June 1558, threatened the possessors of such heretical books with the death penalty under martial law. The few Protestant survivals from Cranmer's library, surely only a small sample of what he must have owned, included works by the banned authors such as Bucer, Brenz, Bullinger, Luther, Melanchthon, and Oecolampadius, together with the 2 medieval heretics, Wycliffe and Huss, and Stephen Gardner's earlier indiscretion from the time of Henry's breach with Rome, De Vera Obedientia. It comes as no surprise that none of these figured in the Arundel-Lumley collection. And here we'll bring this segment to a close. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. Amen.